We are then left with consciousness itself, pure consciousness, the unifying realm where all our awareness takes place. At this point we experience the origin-immune truth of our primal givenness, in the sense that awareness is given to us. In this way we are aware of a transcendental ego, which is universally true, and is thus part of an absolute being. Heidegger initially accepted Husserl's analysis, but soon began to modify it with ideas of his own. This would be the beginning of his original philosophy. Nonetheless, it would remain heavily indebted to Husserl's phenomenological approach. In 1918, Heidegger was called up and dispatched to a meteorological unit outside Sedan in German-occupied eastern France. By now the German army was beginning to disintegrate as the Allies advanced. Heidegger took part in no actual fighting, but was deeply affected by the historical events unfolding around him. In rapid succession the Kaiser abdicated and fled to Holland. Germany became a republic under a social democratic government, and the German army surrendered. A humiliated Germany was faced with political chaos. The navy mutinied in the northern ports, while Berlin and Munich were in tumult. Heidegger recognized that the entire pre-war way of life, its culture and its bourgeois self-belief, was gone forever. Echoing his belief in phenomenology, he felt nothing was left to him but the force of personality or belief in the intrinsic value of belonging to the central ego. Yet, paradoxically, he could not help but feel a pleasure to be alive, happy that a world that had merely played with the spirit was now coming to an end. The future held the promise of a new era of spirit. Others throughout Germany, imbued with similar spirit, had a different take on affairs. In imitation of Lenin's Bolsheviks in Russia, the South German state of Bavaria declared itself an independent communist republic. The Spartacists led a revolt in Berlin with the aim of establishing a similar Red Republic. Both were soon crushed by the right-wing Freikorps, Free Soldiers, and the Red Terror was followed by a White Terror. Meanwhile, the Allied blockade continued, and many began to go hungry. In 1919, amidst the general despair, Heidegger lost his faith in God. Although he was careful not to inform Husserl, his philosophy was now parting from phenomenology as viewed by its founder. Heidegger was no longer able to accept the transcendental aspects of Husserl's philosophy. He began to consider the transcendental ego as nothing less than an illusion. The proper study of philosophy should be the subject which experiences the world, rather than some bloodless thinking thing which only theoretically thinks the world. The absolute being was no longer the aim of Heidegger's phenomenological endeavor. Yet Heidegger's lack of faith should not be mistaken for a simple atheistic view of the world. His outlook remained deeply spiritual. This had always been part of his character and would remain indelibly so. Heidegger initially overcame this anomaly by regarding his philosophy as the form religion takes in a time of no God. Instead of absolute being, the focus of his philosophy would be the study of being itself. What is being? This would be the central question of his philosophy. Other similar questions open up the different possibilities inherent in this approach. What is? What precisely do I discover when I think about my own existence? What does to exist mean? The shades of meaning are subtle and shifting. What does it mean to exist? Being would be the replacement for Husserl's pure consciousness, but it was approached in much the same way. The being that Heidegger wished to contemplate was as empty of acts and objects as Husserl's bracketed-out consciousness. It was the root that lay beyond science, beyond psychology, beyond even logic, beyond all particularity. Several critics have seen in Heidegger's concept of being a harking back to the ancient idea of the soul. Heidegger initially scorned such willful misinterpretation. Being was both more and less than the soul. It was grounded in existence. Similarly, it was not individual. Like Husserl's pure consciousness, it lay beyond individual particularities and thus took on a universal aspect. The soul continued beyond existence, but being was existence. Despite all his rebuttals, Heidegger's notion of being would at times assume many aspects that had previously been accorded to the soul. As his philosophy developed its more spiritual aspects, it would assume more and more the aspect of a religion without God. Heidegger turned to the history of philosophy, where he discovered a discernible history of being. But this had not been a history of progress. On the contrary, it had been an unwitting depiction of loss. The earliest ancient Greek philosophers, known as the pre-Socratics, had reflected deeply on the question of being. Their thought had achieved considerable penetration into this fundamental notion upon which everything rested. But the advent of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle had been a disaster to such profound and integrated philosophical thought. Under their influence, philosophical thinking had split into separate entities. The attempt to unravel the notion of being had given way to the simple and separate analyses of natural science, political thought, ethics, poetry, and so forth. Meanwhile, the core of philosophy had been reduced to ethereal metaphysics. Socrates had claimed that we know nothing. For Plato, the ultimate reality had been ideas. Aristotle had classified nature into different qualities. As a result, the whole notion of being had been overlooked, and over the centuries our understanding of this most fundamental of concepts had become obscured. A gradual forgetting of being had occurred, and as a result our notion of is had become utterly devalued. What had once been the basis that underlay all philosophy had been reduced to a minor function of grammar. Being, in all its subtlety and depth, had been degraded to a mere copula. Is. A profound mystery had become little more than a verbal glue which held together words in a sentence. Heidegger sought to restore the profound mystery to the word is. This would be done by using a similar method to Husserl's discovery of pure consciousness. Put aside all particular meanings of the copula is, and you come face to face with the mystery of being. By forgetting about being, Western philosophy had reduced humanity to a shallowness where it was barely aware of what being meant. It had become oblivious to the properties inherent in the whole notion of being. Modern humanity lived a life devoid of any essential awareness of what its existence meant. Its beingness had lost all depth. It no longer had any resonance. Humanity's very knowledge of beingness had evaporated amidst a welter of scientific and technological knowledge. Indeed, this was not knowledge at all, just mere know-how. In this way, man's beingness itself had become lost to him. Over the centuries, Western philosophy had caused humanity to lose its primeval experience of itself. This forgetfulness of being had finally resulted in nihilism and a world dominated by technology. Instead of thinking about being, thinking had been reduced to mere logic, science, technology, and the bloodless, beingless metaphysics of post-Socratic philosophy. This had culminated in the age of science. But science does not think. What is all this about? Is anything else but what it is? Is being is more than being is being? Heidegger's contemporary, Wittgenstein, had a similar insight when he remarked, "It is not how things are in the world that is mystical, but that it exists." Yet having made this statement, Wittgenstein preferred to remain silent about such things. In his opinion, this was something we simply cannot talk about in language as we know it. Surprisingly, Heidegger concurred with this approach, after his own fashion. It was indeed impossible to talk about such things in the language as it stood. What was needed was an entirely new form of language which would enable us to grasp the elusive nuances evoked by the concept of being. What might have appeared perilously close to nonsense in normal everyday language would now be expressed in an entirely new philosophical jargon expressly invented by Heidegger for the purpose. It would take Heidegger some years to perfect the technical intricacies of this jargon, but he would eventually succeed in arriving at the point where it is all but impenetrable to the uninitiated. For example, nature, as the categorical aggregate of those structures of being which a definite entity encountered within the world may possess, can never make worldhood intelligible. I have purposely chosen a more simple example, which can, with effort, be understood. But once it is understood, what precisely is understood? Does this kind of verbiage mean anything at all outside